Yesterday, in the second chapter of Pirkei Avos, Rebbe begins, he says, what is the path which one should choose? So he says, something which glorifies the person, do something which glorifies the person. That's the path you should choose. And what glorifies the person? The one who glorifies God. If you glorify God, do something which glorifies God, you become glorified. That's Rebbe's statement in the beginning of Pirkei Avos of the second chapter. So Rabbeinu Yonah, who's one of the commentators on Pirkei Avos, explains that God gave mitzvos to the Jewish people. Now, what are the mitzvos? What are the commandments to Jewish people? What is the value? It's if we observe and we're committed to his will and we participate in his protocol of life, we're doing his will. Because that's what he wants us to do. Now, why did God create existence? The prophet says God created his existence for his honor, for his glory. Does God need glory? God needs no glory. So the way I always explain it is that if we recognize his glory, what he is, because he is glorious, he's infinite, then we're worthy of reward. That's what it means. That's why he needs honor. But if we recognize how honorable he is, that he's infinite and he's absolute in every aspect of absoluteness, then we become worthy to have a relationship with him. That's the concept. So when we do his mitzvos, the 248 positive commandments, and we observe the 365 negative commandments, what profile are we assuming? We're assuming his profile. Because every mitzvah has to do with what? With his commandment. Every aspect of our life is connected because he said so. So when the Jew does the mitzvah, how is he identified? He's identified as God's person. Because the reason why I'm doing this, I'm behaving this way, I'm doing this action, I'm thinking this thought, or my value system is that, this is why. Because that's God's value system. I'm assuming God's value system because that's what he wants. So what does the Jew represent in existence? He's in every aspect of his being, he reflects God. Especially as we said, how many positive commandments are there? 248. How many parts are there to the human body? 248. That means every mitzvah, it corresponds to one aspect of our being. So every aspect of our being, of our behavior, is touched by a positive commandment. Our hand, our heart, our mind, our eyes, every aspect is directly connected to that. Why the 248 limbs and parts of the human body? Because the 248 positive commandments. So the reason why we're endowed with this number is because that's the number of the 248 positive commandments. And yesterday's parsha, the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, based on the Kabbalistic sources, says that observing negative commandments, what is that? The physicality of man, as we discussed, represents all the inclinations for negative, desires, passions. It's the antithesis of spiritual. That's what negative, that's what the physicality represents. Now, if a person, God forbid, takes a foreign substance, how does the system cleanse itself? By denying it, what brought about that impurity within the system or that malfunctioning in the system. And that's why we experience withdrawal symptoms when you abstain and you wean the person from whatever brought about that negative element within the system, which caused the malfunction. That's the understanding. If a person, what's a negative commandment? Negative commandment is refrain. We refrain, we don't cross lines. The more we don't cross that lines, whenever we're confronted, we don't cross those lines, we're weaning ourselves from what that represents. Dietary laws, if you violate it, represents something that causes a malfunction in the spiritual system. That empowers the physicality, the negativity which came about as a result of the tree of knowledge. That empowers that. By weaning yourself, by denying that, the system now is regaining its balance. That's the value of observing a negative commandment. What's a positive commandment? A positive commandment represents that's illumination. That not only do you have to allow the system to recover, you have to infuse it with illumination. That's the positive commandment. So when you do the positive commandment with the body, what are you infusing the body with? With positive. That's illumination. That's the spiritualization of the physicality. To restore it, to have a semblance of what it was before the sin of Adam. And that's the objective and the value of the neshama, of the soul. The soul has an illumination which is not to be understood what it is. And when that engages together with the body to do any one of the 248 positive commandments, this generates an illumination, so not observing the negative is to wean it of the negative. So the physicality of the body is what? Is restabilizing. To have less dysfunction. Now the infusion of the illumination, which is the positive, that's the spiritualization of the physical. And that's the objective of man. That's the purpose and that's the goal. And that's why we exist, to bring about that. To wean the physical of the negative and to empower it and spiritualize it with the positive. And that's only has value because of the soul. We've mentioned many times the name of Rav Chaim Vital, which the Chofetz Chaim cites, that the soul has 248 components to it, which corresponds to 248 parts of the body. The 248 positive commandments, which correlate to the body, is directly connected to the component in the soul. So the positive commandment empowers the neshama, which corresponds to the physical, to the body, to give it that level of illumination. This is the concept. It's phenomenal how the systems work, and they're contrarian to one another. There's this balance. And the question is, who succeeds? Who gets the upper hand? Do you succumb to the negative, which is desire and passion, and you cross those lines? Or do you refrain and you suppress it, and that allows the recovery process to take place within the physicality, and now it's open, what? For the positive. King David says in Tehillim, Somei ra v'asei tov. Remove yourself from evil and do good. What a person, and this is explained, and the Rambam says this in the laws of Tshuva, but it's a Gemara, Talmud says it, a person is contaminated. Now, what's the source of contamination? It comes in contact with a dead rodent, which caused the contamination. Now, how does one relieve himself of that contamination? You have to go into a mikveh, you immerse yourself fully in the mikveh. And if when you submerge, you come out, you're relieved of that contamination. What happens if you go into the mikveh holding on to that dead rodent? You could stay in that mikveh from now forever because you're still connected to that source of contamination. You're never going to be relieved of that contamination. So David HaMelech says, King David says in Psalms, Sumei ra v'asei tov. First, what you have to do is remove yourself. Don't cross the line. Remove yourself from evil. Suppress the desire to do wrong. And now, because he's suppressing it, the body now is in the recovery phase. Infuse it now with good. Asei tov, do good. Remove yourself from evil and do good. So what is the order? What's the sequential order? Removal from evil, do good. Because if you're doing evil and good simultaneously, what's happening? The body is a malfunction phase, mode. So it's like taking the rodent into the mikveh. As much as the mikveh has the ability to relieve you and to spiritualize you, but if you're holding on to that source of contamination, it has no effect whatsoever. identically to have that effect on you, you get credit for the mitzvah. But to spiritualize you, you have to refrain and suppress it and not cross the line. And then the positive commandment has the ability to infuse the system with the holiness, with the spiritual positive commandment. Even if something's a kosher species, unless you ritually slaughter it, you're not permitted to eat it. And if you don't, and you kill it, it's called a carcass. And it contaminates. It contaminates that if a Jew touches an animal that was not ritually slaughtered, you touch it, you become contaminated. Because it has to be ritually slaughtered. Let me explain it. Now, what's considered ritual slaughter for an animal? The two signs in the animal, you have the esophagus and you have the trachea. They have to be cut, severed in a certain way by a person who's qualified to be a ritual slaughterer. And if you cut the majority of those two signs, the trachea and the esophagus, the animal has been ritualized. That's called ritual slaughter. The meat is kosher meat. That meat will not contaminate because it was spiritualized through that ritual slaughter. If this ritual slaughter is not done appropriately, there's a nick on the knife, or he does not cut the majority of those two signs, and the animal dies, it's a carcass. It contaminates. You touch it, you carry it, you become contaminated. But you have to cut both signs. A bird, a kosher species that you're permitted to eat, you have to cut one sign. A bird also has two, has a trachea, has an esophagus. You only have to cut one of the two. You don't have to cut both. Why? Because the animal is similar to the human being. As the human being was made from earth, in terms of physicality, the animal was also made from earth. Identically the same. Except the animal is a life source, the human being has a soul. Therefore, because it's in the classification of the human, its life has greater value. It's a higher level of life, the animal. So when you ritualize it, you have to do a greater overt act to ritualize it. Therefore, you have to cut both sides. A bird, if you read the order of creation, the bird was created on the 5th day of creation. The bird is a composite of water and earth. The animal is totally earth. The bird was made of water and earth. It's a different reality in terms of its source. Because it's not totally earth, which has this commonality with the human being, it's sufficient to cut only one of the signs, either the trachea or the esophagus. One doesn't have to cut both. So it's a lesser species. So just as a human being, when he dies, if you come in contact with the remains of the human being, you become contaminated. The animal, which shares the physical commonality with the human being, if you come in contact with its carcass, you become contaminated. That's why you become contaminated, for that same reason. Because the animal and the human being have this commonality in our physicality. We start from the same place, all earth. The bird, on the other hand, which is not all earth, it's a composite of earth and water. Therefore, it does not contaminate if you touch it. Only if you eat it. If you eat it and swallow it, that's when you become contaminated. Okay? Now, what about rodents? Rodents normally don't contaminate. Insects, rodents, fish, they don't contaminate. If you touch them when they die, they don't contaminate. However, we read 2 weeks ago, there are 8 rodents, specifically 8, which the Torah speaks about. If you touch them when they're dead, they contaminate. But outside of those 8 rodents, other rodents do not contaminate. Why did God choose these 8? Only God knows. But there's something innate in representation of these 8 rodents, that their remains, their carcasses, whatever you want to call it, they contaminate. Any other rodent doesn't. Because the rodent is a low-lying creature. It's not an animal. Animal, you have domesticated, undomesticated. That's the animal. The rodents weren't created like the animal also. Now, it's interesting. A bird could fly. An animal cannot fly. Because the bird is a composite of water, which doesn't have the heaviness and the weightiness of earth. It's not as earthy. Therefore, it's lighter. It has the ability to fly. What I'm telling you is not based on Kabbalistic explanations. An animal, which is similar to the human being in the physicality, it's earthy, it's heavy, it's dense. Because of that denseness, as a result of that, it cannot fly. A bird could fly for that reason. Okay? But that's what it's about. So that sort of contamination emanates from the earthiness of the makeup, of the physical makeup of that creature, of that species. Last night, I have a neighbor, lives down the street from me, a very fine person, Talmud Chacham, fine man. And he says to me, he says, he has a bird on the upper part of his house. When I want to do the mitzvah shlucha kan, I'm welcome to come. After Shabbos, there's a positive commandment that if you have a mother bird nesting on its eggs or on its chicks, the Torah says you should send away the mother bird and take the chicks. Positive, it's one of the 248 positive commands. It's called shlucha kan, sending off the nest, that you send off the mother before you take the birds. And the Torah tells us explicitly, Barachta Yomim, you'll merit longevity. And the Talmud says longevity doesn't mean in the physical world only, it means in the spiritual world. It has a special value. And if you read the Midrash, all kinds of blessings come due to this mitzvah. Person doesn't have children, God forbid, he merits to have children. Person doesn't have a livelihood, he merits livelihood. Person doesn't have good health, he'll merit good health. It generates phenomenal things. Phenomenal things. This mitzvah can only be carried out, and Torah is very specific. It has to be a kosher species, the bird. It cannot be a non-kosher species. It has to be a healthy bird. Let's say it has a punctured lung. It doesn't work. And you have to meet certain criteria. And also, the bird has to be ownerless. It cannot be owned by anyone. It has to be an ownerless bird, and the location which is nesting has to be an ownerless location. But if you meet all the criteria, kosher species, it's nesting on its chicks, on its own chicks, and also it's preferably a female. It's the mother. The mother's nesting, not the father, because the mother it incubates those eggs, and it's ownerless. So when I did it, I climbed the ladder last night. The ladder was more than a 20-foot ladder to get to the top. And I took a broom handle, and it was a dove. A dove was nesting on the chicks or on the eggs. Originally, when they did it themselves, there were eggs. So they said to me, there may be chicks already in the nest. And afterwards, I should put my hand in the nest and pick it up and acquire the chicks, because you're supposed to acquire them, to take them. So I climb up and I look the mother right in the eye, and the mother is there, the mother dove. And I take the broom handle and just touch the dove. It flies off immediately. I put my hand in the nest. I realize they're no longer eggs. I feel like newborn chicks in there. I didn't want it. I tried to pull it out. They were so attached to the nest. I just picked up the whole nest and I put it down. So when I came down, I said to my wife also, it's interesting. Why did God create kosher species of birds? Why? What's its value? Kosher species, not kosher species. You know why? What is the blueprint for creation? The blueprint for creation is the Torah. Why? Because God only created the world to be able to fulfill the Torah. So if the only way you're able to fulfill the mitzvah of sending off the mother bird, it must be a kosher species. If that's the case, you need kosher species. Otherwise, you can't fulfill this mitzvah of sending off the mother bird. You understand? The blueprint of the world, there's nothing superfluous in the world. Everything exists in the world. It's only because it's necessary to actualize the Torah. So why is it a kosher species and not non-kosher species? And why does it have lungs? And if it's you perforate its lung, it becomes a non-viable bird. It's because to meet the criteria of what you need to fill the mitzvah, you have to meet all these criteria. So the bird is created with all these internal organs because everything is crucial and essential to be able to fulfill that positive commandment. But why? Because everything in the physical is only a representation of what's in the spiritual realm. That's the reason why. This is what I said right after I sent off the mother bird. That's what percolated in my mind. So therefore, as I said, the physicality of the world. Now, the Torah speaks about in the portion of Shmini, that's 2 weeks ago, the kosher species, domesticated, undomesticated, reptiles, fish, what determines something whether it's kosher species or not. And then in this last week's reading, we speak about a woman who conceives, gives birth to a male, a female, what the laws are pertaining to her status. So why does it first mention the animal, the laws of the animal, which is kosher and non-kosher, and then, or the fish, or the reptiles, or the grasshoppers, and then the human being? Because just as at the beginning of creation, God created the non-intelligent species before he created the human being, which was the last aspect of creation. Adam and Eve were created on the 6th day. Identically, when the Torah presents the laws of the species, it first mentions the laws of the species first, and then it mentions the laws which pertain to the person. That's the reason why it's in that order, that sequential order. As creation was in that sequential order, so the laws which pertain to these species are also in that sequential order. What does one thing have to do with another? It is, why did God create all those species? Because they were necessary for the human being that when he comes on the scene to be able to address his own spiritual growth. He needs all those species. What does he do with them? Their laws. Just as those species preceded the human being, which tells us that the center of the universe is the human being, and when he came on the scene, everything was in place. Identically, the laws that we discuss are first stated because those laws pertain to the human being perfecting himself. That's the concept. God created kosher species because, non-kosher species because you're not permitted to eat it. And the kosher species, you not only sometimes you're permitted, you must eat them. It comes the Paschal lamb. It has to be a sheep or a goat. Sacrifices. Only certain species qualify for sacrifices. Other species don't. Certain birds, a dove, a turtle dove. Those are the only birds which qualify for sacrifices in the Mishkan or in the temple. No one does. So all these characteristics and these laws are only in place because there's a human being. So first we discuss the laws, the classifications of these species. And then we speak about the laws which pertain to the person, because all of that, what we discussed earlier, only exists because of the human being. The Mishnah tells us at the end of Brachos that a person prays to God and says, allow your mercy to come upon me. The way your mercy comes upon the mother nesting on its chicks, meaning you send off the mother at the chicks or the eggs. If you say, as your mercy is upon the mother bird, that same mercy should be upon me. It says you silence that person. You say to the person, don't say it. You're not permitted to say that. So the Gemara explains why. Because you're taking God's characteristics and you're turning him into human characteristics. What does that mean? So the Vilna Gaon cites the Jerusalem Talmud, and explains what happened when you send off that mother bird. You think the mother bird doesn't know what you're going to do? You're going to take away its chicks or its eggs? The mother bird is so distraught, you know what it does? It finds the closest body of water and drowns itself. It puts itself out of its own misery. So therefore, when you're praying, God says, send off the mother bird. So you understand it because you're doing an act of compassion, but you don't realize what you're doing is an act of cruelty. So therefore, when you pray to God, you should do to me what you're doing to the bird. what you're doing to the bird, you don't want that to happen to you, because that's the ultimate cruelty. So how do we understand it? So he'd say, well, it's the will of God. It's a statue we don't understand. But the Vilna Gaon explains it this way. When we send off the mother bird, you know what the angels say to Hashem? Why don't you have mercy and compassion for the mother bird? Why are you allowing this to happen? You know what God says to the angels? When my children are persecuted and killed and displaced, you don't come to me. Why are you allowing your children to be tortured? But the bird, you worry about the bird. So because of that, Hashem says, if you people are not concerned, you angels are not concerned for my people, I will express the greatest level of mercy for my children. You understand? By doing this act, this causes the angels to speak the way they speak. Automatically, it causes God to demonstrate and express the greatest level of mercy on the Jewish people.
That's right, because from a continuity